First of all, I want to thank Insper for the generous invitation, and particularly Marco Lisboa. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. It's also a great honor to be able to share this discussion with Justice Barroso and Professor Melo. I really look forward to the debate. I want to apologize also for not being able to give this talk in Portuguese. I studied Portuguese a little bit as a student, and my wife said, "You should try to give the speech in Portuguese." And thought about it, and I just thought that's going to be just a major embarrassment. And so, how do you? What's the word that you use for humiliation in Portuguese? Seche. 7-1. Yeah. All right. So Daniel and I wrote How Democracies Die because we were worried about the fate of American democracy. As you know, I'm sure partisan polarization has reached levels that we haven't seen since the end of the Civil War. And Americans have just elected a president with clear authoritarian tendencies. So our book tries to draw lessons from other democracies that have broken down elsewhere in the world and apply them to the United States. And I'll talk a little bit about that today, but I also want to try to apply some of those lessons to the case of Brazil. I'm not an expert on Brazilian politics. I tried to study up on the 35 different political parties before I got here, and I got a terrible headache trying to figure out the difference between the Partido Comunista de Brasil and the Partido Comunista Brasileiro, and the Partido Republicano Brasileiro and the Partido Republicano Progressista, and there are two other Partido Republicanos. So I put that aside and took an aspirin. But I think that the book's core ideas are, in fact, relevant here. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak and to exchange ideas. So let me start by pointing out that democracies do not die the way they used to die. Democracies used to die at the hands of men with guns, generals. During the Cold War, 3 out of every 4 democratic breakdowns took the form of a military coup. Brazil in 1964 is a classic example. And in fact, a lot of Brazilians I still think that that's the way that democracy will die. I think it's not. Contemporary democracies die in very different ways. They die in a much more subtle way. Since the end of the Cold, they die at the hands not of generals, but at the hands of elected leaders, of presidents and prime ministers who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert it. Since the end of the Cold War, a solid majority of autocrats in the world have come to power through elections, and they've consolidated their rule, consolidated their power through democratic institutions. They use elections, they use referendums, they work through Congress where they can control it. They try very quickly to get control of the judiciary and then use the courts to legalize or to legitimize their abuses. This is Hugo Chavez, it's Putin, it's Orban, it's Erdogan, it's Ortega, Rafael Correa, Duterte, the list goes on. What makes this electoral path to autocracy so dangerous is that it's kind of hidden behind a democratic facade. Things look pretty normal. There's no dramatic coup d'etat where the general seizes power and the president is exiled and the constitution is suspended and a junta takes charge. There are no tanks in the streets. You still have elections, you still have a Congress, you still have a constitution. The subversion of democracy today is much more subtle. It's usually much more incremental. It's often very slow. Erdogan's party in Turkey, the AKP, won power in 2002. It was not until 2007 or 8 that one began to notice a slide into authoritarianism. Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998. It wasn't until 2006 or 7 that it became clear that the regime was sliding into authoritarianism. As a result, because it's so slow, subtle, incremental, many citizens, many opinion makers are not aware that they're losing democracy until it's too late. In Venezuela, a survey in 2011, 13 years after Hugo Chavez was elected, found that a majority of Venezuelans still believed that they were living under a democracy. So if democratic breakdown today begins not at the barracks, but at the ballot box, it becomes really important. One of the real keys to protecting democracy is keeping authoritarians from getting elected in the first place. And that means we have to be able to identify these guys before they come to power. We need to be able to identify potential authoritarians while they're still candidates. Back in the 1970s, the great Spanish political scientist, Juan Linz, wrote a book in which he proposed what he called a litmus test to identify authoritarian behavior. And in our book, we provide kind of a revised and updated version of that litmus test. The litmus test includes 4 categories of behavior that should set off warning bells, that should make us worry if we see it. Let me quickly go through them. One of them is a refusal to play by democratic rules, a rejection of democratic rules of the game, pretty obvious. A second is a toleration or encouragement of violence. A third is denial of the legitimacy of one's partisan opponents. And the fourth is an expressed willingness to curtail the civil liberties of critics, opponents, or the media. Now, obviously, there is no foolproof system, no perfect system for identifying autocrats before they come to power. But in fact, most elected autocrats out there test positive on our litmus test. Going back in history, Perón, Chavez, Ortega, Correa, Putin, Erdogan. In other words, most of the politicians who turn out to be authoritarian show clear signs of authoritarianism before they come to power, so they can be identified. Most of these guys do what they say they're going to do, which means we need to take their word seriously. Now, extremist demagogues appear from time to time in just about every democracy in the world. The United States has had many of them. We have one sitting in the White House right now. The key question is how to keep these guys away from the center of power. And here the political elite and political parties and the political establishment in general has a really important role. Elected authoritarians rarely come to power on their own. They almost always get help from the establishment. Someone from the political or economic elite opens the door for them. This is usually based on a tragic miscalculation. Some mainstream politicians or parties calculate that they can benefit in the short term, politically, from an alliance with the extremists. It'll help them win this election. It'll help them stay in power. It'll help them avoid the election of some rival they don't like. And they assume, of course, that if the extremist wins, they can control him. The establishment can control him. That Faustian bargain very often backfires. In Italy in the 1920s, liberal leader Giovanni Giolitti, seeking to tap into Mussolini's mass appeal, included the fascists on his Liberal Party's parliamentary lists. That did not end well. His career ended soon. Mussolini was soon in power. In Weimar, Germany, the leader of the Conservative Party forged an alliance with Hitler in the late 1920s, hoping, again, to use Hitler's grassroots appeal to shore up the base of his declining Conservative Party. When other conservative leaders started to get worried in 1932, when Hitler was named chancellor, conservative leader Franz von Papen told them, don't worry, within 2 months we'll have pushed Hitler into such a corner that he will squeal. More recently, in Venezuela, former President Rafael Caldera publicly sympathized with Hugo Chávez's coup attempt in 1992, helping to legitimate it, and then as president 2 years later, let him out of prison. Caldera knew very well that Hugo Chávez was a dangerous demagogue, but he believed that Chávez's political star would fade very quickly and he'd be forgotten about before the 1998 election. So in all 3 of these cases, mainstream politicians opened the door to extremist demagogues. In all 3 cases, it turned out to be a tragic miscalculation. Juan Linz, the original author of our litmus test, spent his entire career studying how democracies die. He was born in Weimar, Germany. He grew up in Spain during the Civil War and really dedicated his professional career to figuring out how democracies die. And one of the core lessons that he drew is that at a time when an authoritarian emerges on the scene, mainstream politicians and parties must do everything humanly possible to keep these guys away from the centers of power. That means not only avoiding the temptation to align with extremists, which makes sense, but it also means, and this is harder, it also means being willing to join forces with your ideological rivals in order to beat the extremist. In Linz's words, I want to quote him because I think it's important, when faced with an authoritarian threat, mainstream politicians must join with opponents who are ideologically distinct or ideologically distant, but committed to the survival of the democratic political order. The Italian liberals, German conservatives, Rafael Caldera, all failed to do that, and all three of their democratic political orders collapsed. Now, again, Dan and I wrote this book, or we decided to write the book, when we realized that U.S. Republicans had also failed in 2016 to heed Linz's advice. Donald Trump tests unambiguously positive on our authoritarian litmus test. He threatened not to accept the results of the election. He threatened to jail his opponent. He encouraged violence at campaign rallies. He threatened legal action against critics in the media. No major party presidential candidate in modern U.S. history had ever behaved in this way. So how did Trump make it to the White House? How did that happen? In part, it was the U.S. A product of the U.S. primary system, which limits party leaders' ability to stop demagogues. But Republican Party leaders also very clearly failed to take Linz's advice. Republican leaders knew that Donald Trump was a demagogue. They knew damn well that he was unfit for the office of the presidency. But resisting a demagogue on one's own side of the political spectrum is hard. It very often means short-term political defeat, and no politician likes to lose. So politicians very often rationalize. They tell themselves, well, the demagogue might not be that bad. Or they tell themselves they can control the demagogue. Or that in any event, it's better to elect him than some rival we don't like. And that's what Republican leaders did. No major Republican leader, not a single elected Republican official was willing to do the one thing that would have ensured Donald Trump's defeat, and that is endorse Hillary Clinton. That sent the fact that every single Republican leader, major Republican leader at the national level, either endorsed Trump or kind of hid under the table and took no position, that sent a crucial signal to Republican voters. It told Republicans that Trump was an acceptable candidate and that this was just a normal election. That turned the election into a standard two-party race in the United States, which in the context of a so-so economy and a president with so-so approval ratings and a very, very tightly divided electorate, Trump was able to win. Now, the election of authoritarian president does not necessarily mean the death of democracy. It's not necessarily fatal to democracy. This is where political institutions come into play. Americans, as I'm sure you know, have a lot of faith in our constitutional system, and for a pretty good reason. Our constitutional system of checks and balances has, in fact, constrained a number of powerful and ambitious presidents, from Andrew Jackson to Roosevelt to Nixon. But one of the core arguments of our book, and I'm going to hopefully bring this back to Brazil as well, is that the Constitution is never enough. Formal rules are never enough to protect a democracy. Constitutional checks and balances do not work automatically. They have to be reinforced by strong democratic norms, unwritten rules. And our book focuses on two unwritten rules in particular that we think are essential to democracy. I want to take a couple minutes to explain them, and then eventually we'll bring them back to the case of Brazil. The first one is what we call mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of one's partisan opponents. That means that no matter how much we may disagree with the other party, no matter how much we may really dislike the leaders of the other party, we recognize both privately and publicly that they are loyal citizens who love the country and who have an equal and legitimate right to compete for power, and if they beat us, to govern. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. We do not treat them as an existential threat. The second norm is what we call forbearance. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right It is an act of self-restraint. It is an underutilization of one's institutional power. We do not often think about forbearance in politics, certainly not in Latin American politics, but it is absolutely vital to democracy. Think briefly about what the United States president constitutionally, legally can do. The president can pardon anybody he wants anytime, apparently including himself. We'll see. Any president, any U.S. president with a majority in Congress can pack the Supreme Court. If the president does not like the ideological composition of the Supreme Court, if he has a majority in Congress, he can pass a law expanding it to 11, 13, 15, fill it with allies. Completely legal. Think about what the U.S. Congress can do. The U.S. Congress can prevent the president from filling any of its cabinet posts, from filling any Supreme Court vacancies. It can refuse to fund the government, shutting the government down. And of course, it can remove the president on any grounds that it wants. My point here, because that stuff doesn't happen, at least it didn't until recently, much in the United States. My point is that politicians can exploit the letter of the Constitution, even a really good Constitution like the United States Constitution. Politicians can exploit the letter of the Constitution in ways that eviscerate the spirit of the Constitution. My colleague, legal scholar Mark Tushnet, calls this behavior constitutional hardball. Constitutional hardball is using the letter of the law to undermine the spirit of the law. Look at any failing or failed democracy across the world and you'll find an abundance of constitutional hardball. Spain and Germany in the 30s. Argentina under Perón, actually Argentina virtually any time. Venezuela under Chavez. Contemporary Hungary, Poland, Turkey. Constitutional hardball should be familiar to anybody who follows Latin American politics. Court packing is a great example. Argentine politicians are a master of this. Perón, Menem, Kirchner, all packed the Supreme Court, all of them using technically legal constitutional means. Impeachment can also be a form of constitutional hardball. Impeachment, as all of you know, is a very powerful tool, right? It is absolutely essential. It's an essential tool in any presidential democracy. Congress must have the power to remove a president who threatens the rule of law or is grievously corrupt. But it's a tool that has great power because it violates, if used, it violates the will of the electorate, right? So it's really damaging to the core of democracy. So impeachment is something that should be used with great caution, with great self-restraint. In Latin America, that's not always the case. In Latin America, it's been the case that impeachment is used simply to remove a president that Congress doesn't like. I think the greatest example of this is Paraguay in 2012, when President Lugo was removed in 2 days in a show trial. The president of Paraguay was given 2 hours to defend himself. It was a joke. Another great example is Ecuador in 1997. Congress did not like President Abdallah Bucaram, but they didn't have the 2/3 vote in the Congress to impeach him. So they used a clause in the Constitution, in Ecuador's Constitution, several constitutions ago, that allows Congress to remove the president for mental incapacity with a bare majority. Congress never debated, never said a word, never spent 1 minute discussing whether President Bucaram was in fact mentally capable or not, but they used that clause to remove him from office. Constitutional hardball turns what should be neutral political institutions into partisan weapons. That can destabilize and in some cases even kill a democracy. This is Peronist Argentina, it's Chavista Venezuela, it's Turkey today. What prevents a constitutional system of checks and balances from descending into regime-threatening constitutional hardball is the norm of forbearance. It's a shared commitment among politicians to institutional restraint, to defending the spirit of the law above and beyond the letter of the law. It's politicians saying, yeah, legally I could do that, but that's not how we do things here. That's absolutely crucial to democracy. Just give one example. Think about presidential term limits historically in the United States. Prior to 1951, for 150 years, there were no term limits for presidents in the United States. The president could run and be president for life like Hugo Chavez. But after George Washington stepped down after 2 terms, no president sought a 3rd term. It was not that it wasn't the Constitution that prevented very powerful, very popular, very ambitious presidents like Andrew Jackson, Ulysses S. Grant, Thomas Jefferson from seeking a 3rd term. They could have done it. They would have loved to do it. They had the power to do it. They didn't do it. Not because of the Constitution, but because of forbearance. It was an act of institutional self-restraint. It was an unwritten rule of self-restraint. Danny and I argue in the book that these 2 norms of mutual toleration and forbearance serve as kind of the soft guardrails of democracy. They are what help to prevent normal, healthy, partisan competition, which exists in every democracy, from escalating into the kind of partisan war to the death that wrecked democracies in Europe in the 1930s and in South America in the 1960s and 70s. In the United States, norms of forbearance and mutual toleration were pretty strong for most of the 20th century. But in our book, we argue that these norms have been weakening over the last couple of decades. During the Obama presidency in particular, Republicans began to abandon mutual toleration. Republican leaders told their followers repeatedly that President Obama didn't love America, that Obama and the Democrats were not real Americans. Hillary Clinton received a similar treatment. Trump repeatedly called her a criminal, and Republicans chanted, "Lock her up," live on national television in their national Congress. The erosion of mutual toleration, when we start to see the other side as an enemy or as an existential threat, worries us a lot. Because without mutual toleration, politicians are tempted, indeed encouraged, to engage in constitutional hardball. Why is that the case? When we view our rivals as enemies, when we view our rivals as an existential threat, we grow tempted to use any means necessary, any tool available to keep them from coming to power. And that's exactly what's beginning to happen in the United States. Constitutional hardball is on the rise in the U.S. An early example was the partisan impeachment of Bill Clinton, basically on a technicality. That was the first impeachment in 130 years in the U.S. In 12 or 13 Republican-controlled states in the last decade, legislatures have passed laws making it more difficult for people to register and vote. And it's very clear that those who have a harder time voting are low-income and minority voters who just happen to be the base of the Democratic Party. Most stunning of all, though, in terms of constitutional hardball, was the Senate's refusal in 2016 to allow President Obama to fill the Supreme Court vacancy created by the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. That move, not allowing the president a chance to fill a Supreme Court vacancy, was unprecedented. The first time that happened since 1866, since the Civil War. So the problem is not just that Americans have elected a demagogue, it's that they've elected a demagogue at a time when the soft guardrails protecting our democracy have weakened or coming unmoored. So the question is, what leads to that? What causes the weakening of democratic norms? Daniel and I argue that the cause is polarization. Republicans and Democrats in the United States have come to fear and loathe one another. In a really interesting fact, in 1960, there was a survey of Americans that found that 5% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats would be unhappy if their child married someone from the other party. Today, it's 50%. 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats say that they fear the other party. We have not had this level of partisan hatred and animosity since the end of the Civil War. And this is not just traditional left-right polarization. People don't hate each other this way over taxes or health care reform. The differences, the partisan differences in the United States run much deeper. They're about race, religion, and culture. Whereas the Democratic Party has become a very heterogeneous mix of urban, secular whites and a range of ethnic minorities, the Republican Party, by contrast, has become almost exclusively, or remains almost exclusively, white and Christian. So what? Why do white Christians matter? White Christians matter because they used to be an overwhelming majority in the United States. And not only were they an overwhelming majority, but they used to sit unchallenged atop the country's political, economic, social, cultural hierarchies. They filled the presidency, they filled the Congress, they filled the Supreme Court, they were the CEOs of the major businesses, they were the religious leaders, they were the newscasters, they were the college professors. Those days are long over. But losing a majority, and importantly, losing one's dominant social status, can be deeply threatening. Many, many Republican voters feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that, we argue, is what ultimately fuels polarization in the United States. The problem is that polarization can kill democracies. When politics is so deeply polarized that each side views a victory by the other side as something that's intolerable, unacceptable, democracy is in trouble. Because when an opposition victory is intolerable, we begin to justify using extraordinary measures to prevent it. Things like violence, election fraud, coups. That is what happened in Spain in the 1930s. It's what happened in Brazil in the early 60s. It's what happened in Chile in the 70s. It's what happened in Venezuela in the early 2000s. Polarization erodes democratic norms. And without mutual toleration and without forbearance, you get a democracy without guardrails. Politics becomes a fight to the death, and very often it is democracy that dies. Now, American democracy is pretty hard to kill. Our institutions are still pretty robust. But polarization is clearly weakening the informal foundations, the informal norms that sustained our institutions for so long. So I think there's real reason for concern. All right, shifting gears. What about Brazil? Again, I'm not an expert on Brazilian politics, so you shouldn't take anything I say from here forward very seriously. But I think our book's arguments apply here as well. First of all, most obviously, just like the United States in 2016, Brazilians face the specter of an authoritarian presidential candidate, Jair Bolsonaro. With the help of a couple of Harvard graduate students, I did a little bit of homework and applied our litmus test to Bolsonaro. And you'll be surprised to learn he tested unambiguously positive. Let me run through the 4 indicators. Does he reject democratic rules of the game? Throughout his career since 1985, Bolsonaro has praised the military dictatorship and called into question the legitimacy of the post-1985 democracy. In 1993, he declared, "I am for dictatorship," and called for a closure of Congress, like Alberto Fujimori had just done in neighboring Peru. More recently, Bolsonaro denied that what happened in 1964 was a coup. He declared that he wants to govern with the armed forces. He supported a Chavista-like packing of the Supreme Court, and he questioned the legitimacy of Brazil's electoral system, calling it rigged. He just named as a vice presidential candidate someone who on multiple occasions has shown himself or declared himself to be open to a military coup. So not only has Bolsonaro rejected democratic rules of the game, but he's done so in a way that is more egregious and more open than many elected authoritarians out there in the world. More open, more egregiously than Erdogan in Turkey, than Orban in Hungary, than Fujimori in Peru, than Chavez in Venezuela. None of those guys openly embraced dictatorship. All right, so check that box. Second, toleration or encouragement of violence. In 1998, Bolsonaro said the military should have killed 30,000 people, including Fernando Henrique Cardoso. He has encouraged the extrajudicial police killing of suspected criminals. He has praised death squads in Rio, and he's justified the extrajudicial killing of 19 farm workers in Pará in '96. So yes. Number 3, denying the legitimacy of one's partisan rivals. Bolsonaro has called President Cardoso a corrupto who should have been killed during the dictatorship. He has repeatedly called Lula a criminal who should be jailed, and he said that in government he will treat the MST as terrorists. So yes. Number 4, a willingness to curtail the civil liberties of opponents. Bolsonaro has repeatedly endorsed the use of torture and extrajudicial killing, including, and I would say particularly, of leftist activists and politicians. So Bolsonaro is a thoroughly authoritarian figure. And that distinguishes him, I think, quite clearly, quite significantly, from his main rivals in the 2018 presidential race, Alckmin, Ciro, Marina Silva, Fernando Haddad. I was asked by my hosts to also do a little homework and apply the litmus test to the other major candidates, and we came up with very little. None of them passed the litmus test. Little homework, Ciro Gomez appears to have a pretty big mouth, but we couldn't find any behavior that suggests authoritarianism. He's an established politician with a track record of democratic governance. Being hot-tempered and being offensive is not the same thing as being authoritarian. Taking bribes, as Lula allegedly did, is not the same thing as being authoritarian. This is a very important point. Center-left politicians, even corrupt ones, are not a direct threat to democracy. Authoritarian politicians are a direct threat to democracy. So Brazil may be headed to one of those critical moments that Linz wrote about. Those critical moments when political and economic elites have to resist the temptation to work with extremists. Moments like this, politicians and I cannot stress this enough, politicians cannot allow their short-term political or policy goals to prevail over a far-sighted defense of democracy. This is the historic mistake that Italian liberals made. It's the mistake that German conservatives made. It's the mistake that U.S. Republicans are making right now. Now, I know that very few people in the political elite are backing Bolsonaro right now, and that's a very positive thing. But I worry about the second round. I worry about a second round in which Alckmin doesn't make it. What happens then? What happens if it's Bolsonaro against Ciro? What happens if it's Bolsonaro against the PT? Not clear. I worry when I read that Bolsonaro received applauses at the recent last month meeting of the Confederación Nacional de Industria. I worried when I read that CNI President Andrade reported that many entrepreneurs like Bolsonaro because he shows authority. I worry a lot that business leaders ultimately will decide that Bolsonaro is worth the risk because of the economic policies that Paulo Guedes can provide, or maybe because it's better than having to deal with a government led by Ciro or Haddad. Again, I think that would be an historic mistake. All right, so how strong are Brazil's democratic norms? I actually think that from the early 1990s until sometime into Dilma's presidency, they were reasonably strong, certainly relative to other Latin American democracies. The two main parties, PT and PSDB, accepted one another as legitimate. They didn't like each other very much. They competed seriously against one another, but they did not treat one another as enemies. Brazilian politicians engaged with a fair amount of forbearance between, say, 1994 and 2014. The kind of constitutional hardball that we saw over and over again in the 90s and 2000s in Argentina and Peru and Ecuador and Bolivia was less common in Brazil. For the most part, Brazilian politicians did not use institutions, at least not egregiously, as weapons against their opponents. There were no Menem or Kirchner or Chavez-style court packings. There were no politicized impeachments like in Ecuador and Paraguay. There were no efforts to exclude major candidates like in Mexico and Peru. There were no reinterpretations of the Constitution to allow the president to run for a third or fourth or, God forbid, fifth term. But things have changed, as they have in the United States. They've changed here in Brazil in the last 4 or 5 years. Politics has polarized, as all of you know, and as a result, mutual toleration has declined quite markedly. During Dilma's presidency in particular, part of the center-right opposition began to view the PT as an existential threat. They worried that the PT was becoming a hegemonic party that would entrench itself in power for decades like the Mexican PRI. Some people on the right even began to describe the PT as a totalitarian threat. For its part, the PT began to cast even its moderate center-right opponents as golpistas, especially after the impeachment of Dilma. Some Petistas even now routinely call their right-wing opponents fascists. when center-left and center-right parties are calling each other fascist and totalitarian, we have a problem. The erosion of mutual toleration, when we start seeing the other side as an existential threat, encourages constitutional hardball. When we view our rivals as golpista, as totalitarian or Chavista, we grow tempted to use any means necessary to thwart them. And in fact, Brazilian politics has experienced a pretty marked rise in constitutional hardball in the last few years. Dilma's impeachment is a clear example. I disagree with my PT friends. Dilma's impeachment was not a coup. It was far from a coup. It was completely legal. It was completely constitutional. But it was also a clear case of constitutional hardball. Dilma was impeached on a technicality for political reasons. The fact that most Brazilians supported it does not change the fact that it was constitutional hardball. Dilma also, of course, engaged in constitutional hardball. A clear case was her ultimately failed effort to name Lula as her chief of staff to protect him from prosecution. And I think that the case of Lula is also a troubling case of constitutional hardball. His imprisonment and his exclusion from the presidential race, again, is entirely legal. It may well be justified. But it's also a case of judicial hardball because judges clearly sped up the case and pressed the law to the hilt. So even if you think that was the right thing to do, and you can make a legitimate argument that that's the right thing to do, the political consequences of that kind of hardball are very serious. We now have a situation in which one of Brazil's major political parties, the PT, believes deeply that its rivals are playing dirty. Petistas believe that their party was illegitimately removed from power in 2016 and that its rivals have used blatantly undemocratic means to prevent them from coming back to power in 2018. This is a real problem. Brazil is facing a real problem of polarization. On the one hand, much of the center-right now fears that the PT wants to govern in perpetuity and will use any means necessary to stay in power. On the other hand, the PT views even its moderate opponents, the PSDB, as having used illegitimate means to remove it from power and to keep it from returning. Both sides now view one another as dangerous and anti-democratic. Both sides view one another as an existential threat. The problem is made worse, I think, by a decline in mass support for democracy. Recent surveys show that fewer than 20% of Brazilians are satisfied with their democracy. The percentage of Brazilians who say that democracy is always the best system has fallen from 77% in 2010 to 56% today. And according to some surveys, nearly 50% of Brazilians would contemplate a military coup under some circumstances. Now, the erosion of mass support for democracy is probably inevitable given Lava Jato and given the tremendous economic crisis. The erosion of mass support for democracy is not irreversible. It's not necessarily fatal for democracy. But it does leave democracy more vulnerable. And it means that elites must act forcefully to defend it. So I want to spend my last couple of minutes making a case for why elites should defend democracy. Why does it matter? Why should you care? First of all, there is no social science evidence that authoritarianism would solve any of Brazil's problems. There's been a lot of research in economics and political science on the question of whether dictatorships perform better than democracies in terms of economic growth, economic adjustment, and the results are pretty clear. They don't. Performance is pretty similar across regime type. Yes, there have been a few cases, Singapore, Taiwan, now China, that have performed spectacularly well under authoritarianism. But Singapore and China are outliers. If you look at the whole universe of cases, for every China and Singapore, there are dozens and dozens of dictatorships that have failed economically, they've performed poorly. There's also little evidence that authoritarianism would help to solve Brazil's other problems, in particular corruption. Dictatorships do not do a better job of combating corruption. In fact, there's some evidence that they do a considerably worse job of combating corruption. So in all probability, authoritarianism would bring few gains. But I think there's a lot to lose. Strong democratic institutions take a long time to build. It takes decades to establish civilian control of the military. It takes decades to build an independent judiciary, to build a strong Congress. Brazilians, I believe, have done those things pretty well over the last 30 or 35 years. Never before in history have civilian control of the military, judicial independence, and civil and human rights been as deeply entrenched as they are today in Brazil, as they have been in the last quarter century in Brazil. A slide into authoritarianism, even a brief slide into authoritarianism, can wipe out decades of institution building. That's a problem that has long plagued countries like Argentina, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia. Because democracy breaks down, or has historically broken down, every time there's a crisis in Argentina, in Peru, in Ecuador, institutions have never, over 200 years, or 100 years in the case of Argentina, had a chance, had the time to take root. It takes 30 or 40 years. This is a vicious circle that the Argentines and Peruvians are still today trying to dig themselves out of. Democratic consolidation, long-term democratic stability requires that regimes survive some pretty rough storms. U.S. democracy went through the Civil War, went through the Depression, World War II. When you give up on democracy every time a crisis hits, you never build strong institutions. Finally, because I think I've gone way over time, the fate of democracy, the fate of your democracy, has major implications beyond Brazil. The last 30 years have been the most democratic period in Latin American history by far. But there are storm clouds on the horizon. The international environment is much less favorable for democracy today than it was in the 1990s. Europe's influence has declined. Obviously, China and Russia are far stronger, more self-confident than they were. And the current U.S. government has zero interest in promoting or defending democracy. At the same time, public disaffection, public dissatisfaction with democracy has declined across the regions, not just Brazil. It's also Mexico. It's also Colombia, Argentina, Peru, Panama, Guatemala, even Chile. Brazil is a really influential country. If democracy fails here, it could easily trigger a wave of democratic breakdowns across the region. It would not be the first time. The 1964 coup had an enormous impact across Latin America. It encouraged militaries to seize power in Argentina, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Panama, eventually even in Chile and Uruguay. I think it would be a tragedy if that sort of history were to repeat itself. Let me end there. Thank you. Obrigado.
Bom, então Jair Bolsonaro passou no teste autoritário, né? 4 itens checados. É interessante agora a gente poder ouvir o ministro Luiz Roberto Barroso, do Supremo Tribunal Federal, para a gente saber também se as instituições passam no teste. A principal acusação que justamente o Judiciário vem recebendo nos últimos anos e que, de fato, abalou nossas convicções democráticas sobre se estávamos, de fato, no rumo certo, tantas foram as acusações, é de que as instituições usaram o clássico método do lawfare para perseguir adversários políticos e seriam, então, um exemplo gravíssimo de falta de autocontenção democrática. A verdade é que, no outro extremo, do autoritário Jair Bolsonaro, devidamente testado e desaprovado, temos um candidato preso, insistindo na sua candidatura e, como já foi dito várias vezes, levando o processo eleitoral todo a um ambiente de incerteza enorme. É um privilégio ter aqui o ministro Luiz Roberto Barroso, professor também da Universidade Estadual do Rio de Janeiro, no Direito, estadual ou federal? Agora, estadual e profundo estudioso do direito e também um ministro de características muito pessoais, desafiadoras, que tem suas opiniões convictas, enfrenta seus colegas no tribunal. Ministro Barroso, a palavra é sua.
Thank you, Monica. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and take part in this debate. I want to thank Professor Marcos Lisboa for the invitation. They asked me to do this in English, which is not my native language, as you all know. And when you make a presentation, Steve, in a foreign language, you lose all the rhetorical tools you have in your own language. So you better have some ideas, and that's when the trouble starts. I have divided this quick presentation in three parts, basically. In the first one, I want to talk about how democracies are rebuilt. In the second one, I want to talk about the risks and difficulties of the current moment in Brazil. And in the third part, I want to talk about how to preserve democracy. And then I'll close dialoguing with Steve's presentation. So here we go. Part one, how democracies are rebuilt. When I entered law school in another life in 1976, my main concerns were how to end torture, how to end censorship, how to build democratic institutions in a country and in a continent that did not have that tradition. Today, we are discussing how to fight corruption within the framework of the rule of law. We are discussing how to improve the system of justice. We are discussing what we can do to move on from being a middle-income country and become a fully developed country, and along the way raise the private and public ethics of the country. So the first thing I want to say, the first point I want to make, is that the quality of our agenda, the quality of the discussions have improved quite a bit. The second point I would like to make is that these 30 years of democracy we've had, the Constitution will be 30 in October. In these 30 years, we have some main achievements to celebrate, and I'll list three of them. The first one is institutional stability. 30 years of endurance of a constitution is an achievement in Latin America. And these have not been ordinary times. We've had crises, scandals, 2 impeachments, but the Constitution was actually observed during all this time. So we should not take for granted the impressive achievement of 30 years of institutional stability. The second achievement is monetary stability. Whoever here is over 40 has lived, and Marcos mentioned that in his introduction, through the years of hyperinflation. And everyone will have a horror story to tell about that period and how harmful hyperinflation was, particularly toward the poor, as we all know, because they cannot protect themselves in the financial market. And the third achievement of these 30 years of democracy, I would like to stress here, is social inclusion. We've had 30 to 40 million people, the statistics are disputed, that left the line of extreme poverty in Brazil in the past 30 years. I know that with the recession of the past 3 years, there have been some setbacks in this domain, but still the balance is very favorable. So in 30 years, in one generation, we defeated the dictatorship, we defeated hyperinflation, and we defeated or we obtained major victories over extreme poverty. Moreover, in these 30 years, we've had major advancements in what regards human rights, fundamental rights. And we are talking, Steve, about women's rights. We are talking about Afro-Brazilian rights with affirmative actions. We are talking about gay rights. We are talking about native populations' rights. We are talking about freedom of expression. And even animal ethics has improved in Brazil in the past 30 years. So the first chapter of my talk that I end here is the following, my partial conclusion. The picture of this moment, the snapshot, is gloomy. But the movie of the Brazilian democracy in these past 30 years is a fairly good movie. And if we make the right moves, it's headed to a happy end. So this is the first thing I would like to say about democracy in Brazil. So now, part two, let's discuss a little bit about the difficulties and risks of the current moment we are going through. I think one of the main problems that we have to face regarding improving democracy in Brazil is the political system. When I say political system, I'm talking about the system of government, presidential or parliamentary. I'm talking about the electoral system, majoritarian or proportional, and I'm talking about the party system, how they are created and how they function. We have serious problems in these three domains, let me say that. I won't get into the details right now. I don't want to spend much time with this. But the country, Brazil, desperately needs a political reform that can, one, reduce the cost of elections, because this has been the main source of corruption in Brazil in the past decades. In the second place, the second goal of a political reform should be to enhance democratic legitimacy, to improve the representativeness of members of Congress. What has happened in Brazil is that the political class is dangerously detached from civil society. And of course, this is a concern in a democracy. And in the third place, we need a political reform that can facilitate what I would call governability and make sure that the president is not a complete hostage of low politics. So this is, I would probably put a political reform at the top of an agenda to improve Brazilian democracy. The second problem we've been facing, as we all know, is this systemic, endemic, and structural corruption that was more recently revealed. Corruption is a process, it's an accumulative process. So if you want to blame one person, one government, you're doing politics. And by the way, I don't do politics. I just discuss institutions and how to improve them. You won't have a clue who I prefer as far as candidates, present, future, or in the past, because I think this is part of my job. But improving institution is part of my job also. The level of corruption that has been shown in Brazil, this endemic corruption, was astonishing. We are talking about a contagious process that involved private companies, state-owned companies, public agents, private agents, political parties, members of the executive, members of the legislature. It was really embarrassing. It's impossible not to feel ashamed for what happened in Brazil. And now we're trying to get over it. But it's not an easy task. There are three problems, or there are several problems. I'll sort out three of them about fighting corruption in Brazil. The first problem, Steve, is that the progressive side of the political spectrum tends to think that corruption is a footnote in history. That's not too important. And that the ends that you are seeking justify the means. So this is one problem. The other problem is a good part of the Brazilian elite thinks that corruption is only a major problem if it's done by my enemies. If it's done by my friends, the people that play poker with me, or that attend the same parties, then it's not a major problem. So we need to also overcome this perception from a good part of the Brazilian elite. And in the third place, and of course, you have the corrupts themselves that, of course, don't want to push things to improve the struggle against corruption. And among these people, you have two lots. People that don't want to be punished, which I can clearly understand, it's very human. But there is a worse lot made of people that don't want to become honest, not now or ever. And they are very powerful, and they would like to keep things as they have always been. The combination of this political system with this tolerance to corruption has led us to this coalitional presidentialism that we have in Brazil, in which the president is kind of a hostage of this kind of politics. And in order to govern, he needs to build broad alliances, very broad alliances. But the problem is that coalitional presidentialism in Brazil, to a certain extent, has become the determination of what partners are allowed to deviate money and from where. So this is a problem we need to face. I don't think corruption is the main item in the agenda of a country. We have many other things we need to do, and I'll move on to that. But it's not a footnote. It should not be tolerable as an ordinary thing when done by friends, and we need to push, respecting, of course, due process of law, we need to push the traditional corrupts to the margin of history. And now I move on to my third chapter, which is how to preserve democracy. Here, I would like to start saying that one thing we need to do is to create inclusive economic and political institutions. There is a famous book by colleagues of Professor Levitsky, a book called Why Nations Fail, written by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, where they attempt to demonstrate that what leads countries to prosperity is when they can build inclusive economic and political institutions that are capable of creating virtuous cycle of innovation, economic expansion, and more widely held wealth. So the countries that achieve prosperity are the ones that can build inclusive institutions. When you are led by elites that create extractive institutions, economic and political, and where, as it happens many times in Brazil, the state is privately appropriated, these extractive elites, they distribute to the happy few the fruits of the limited economic progress they produce. I think that's a wonderful book, and that's a good diagnosis for what happened in Brazil. And I think the process we're going through is the process of pushing these elites to the margin of history. Another point of the book that I think it's interesting, and I'll move to the book that is our main concern here, is that when you have critical junctures, you have the opportunity to make the necessary changes through the creative destruction of the old order. So what I think we have in Brazil, what's going on in Brazil right now, is a clash between a new order that wants to be born and an old order that would like to keep everything as things have always been. The last point I want to make before I dialogue with Steve and then I close is that, of course, we need to build a suprapartisan agenda for Brazil as a way to fight polarization. And I'll talk about polarization in a minute. I've listed a few points here that I would just mention without being more analytical about it, which are absolute first item of a suprapartisan agenda. Absolute priority for basic education, starting at 0 years old. That's the first and main step. And I think we can easily unite the country. Not education as a slogan, but as an actual priority for Brazil. I think the second item of a suprapartisan agenda should be fiscal responsibility. The third, efficient social programs. We need to protect those who are not competitive because they cannot be competitive. We need more civil society, more free enterprise, and less state. And I think we need a shock of republicanism and efficiency in the public sector. So this is some items of an agenda, I think, to improve, preserve, and advance democracy in Brazil. And now I briefly dialogue with Professor Levitsky talk today and the basic ideas of his incredible book, because it's a very deep and complex reasoning, but when you read it, it seems very clear, obvious, and simple. And I think that's the art of being a great scholar, making complex things easy to understand and easy to agree. So I don't have any major disagreement with his views. I just picked out 3 points of his arguments, and then I bring to a Brazilian discussion, and then I'll close. First point that was stressed in the book and here today is that in the world post-Cold War, democracies die, mostly not at the hands of men with guns, typically through military coups, but at the hands of elected leaders, authoritarian demagogues. So this is the first argument, and he presents several examples. Well, according to many, Brazil is under both risks, both a risk of a military takeover or of a authoritarian demagogue winning the elections. I don't really think we run these two risks. As for the military, I am convinced that they have paid the price of being in power for a long time. And I think they've learned their lesson. So I don't see any true risk. And particularly this, the commander of the army, who is a strong leadership there, is a very legalist man. And I don't fear military coups. I don't even think there are leaderships in the military that could command a process like this. So I know that there are people that it's a minority, but they say they miss the military. This is a funny thing, because these are people that lost their faith in the future, and they dream with a past that never was. Because we are talking about torture. We're talking about censorship. We are talking about the lost decade in Brazil. So they missed things that didn't happen. And as for demagogue winning the elections, of course I cannot talk about candidates, but I don't see this risk. And I think the Brazilian society and the Brazilian people knows better. And I hope for the best, but I really do not think, I think we should be cautious. I think we should be aware of the risks, but I don't think that will actually happen. The second central idea in the book that was emphasized here is that in the US, two unwritten basic norms have preserved checks and balances. Mutual toleration, in the sense that competing parties are legitimate rivals and not enemies to be destroyed, and forbearance, meaning self-restraint in deploying their institutional prerogatives. Here I should say, and now I can talk a little bit about this, that as for mutual tolerance, certainly since the impeachment occurred, resentment and polarization have become quite intense in Brazil. And it's very easy to perceive this. And of course, it's not good. It was very sad, all that happens. I can't give my political views on this, but I'm just describing the fact, the objective fact, that the impeachment process created a major division in Brazilian society with resentment and polarization. This is a fact. As for forbearance, I think we can say that the impeachment itself was an example of lack of forbearance. And here, under a constitutional point of view, all the rules were followed. So I don't think under a legal point of view, we can talk about a coup. But under a political point of view, I think you can have different visions, and there are some important political actors that think that a line was crossed there since the president basically fell for lack of political support in the end of the day. And this is more a parliamentarian way of ousting a president more than in the presidential system when you need an actual crime. Again, I'm just describing things. I'm not giving any opinion because I can't, or at least I shouldn't. And lastly, the last point I want to highlight here is that in liberal democracies are more prone to slow deaths, which takes place over time through a series of measures, reforms, and informal changes that may seem lawful in isolation, but that incrementally deteriorate democratic foundations. I must say that I think the Brazilian institutions and Brazilian democracy, which we are still building and consolidating, but I think the institutions have been quite resilient and fairly effective. Just think of the storms we have been through, and they are still working and functioning quite well. I want to close by saying the following. The magnitude of the current crisis should not, I think, engulf the priceless achievements we have made in these 30 years of democracy, as I said in the first chapter of my presentation. And one other thing I think we can add is, however complex is this moment, the problems regarding democracy in Brazil are less complicated, if I can use this word, than the ones faced by other countries that are our competitors. If you check the BRICS, India is more complex, both regarding democracy and corruption. China is more complex, both regarding corruption and democracy. Russia, it's much more complex, both regarding corruption and democracy. South Africa has major problems. Argentina, who start off, as the book says, the 20th century, as one of the richest countries in the world. Look where Argentina is now. So the problems we are facing, the ones we're dealing with, are less serious or easier to handle. I think we are in a better situation than most of our competitors. So I think we've come a long way. We still have a long way to go. I think Brazilian democracy has been pretty resilient. We need to make important structural changes in the political system to push corruption, major corruption, to the margin of history and make a better and bigger country. Thank you.
Ministro, gostaria de comentar e acrescentar alguma pergunta?
Na verdade, is your device working?
Yes.
I would like to answer in Portuguese to your first question about the role of the judiciary. And I think this is important for Steve to understand a bit what's going on in Brazil. Portanto, eu gostaria de falar, nesses minutinhos que eu tenho antes de ir embora, and I would love you if you could sign it for me. And this is my name. A Mônica suscitou logo ao início o papel do judiciário e esta visível judicialização da vida no Brasil. E eu acho que é difícil entender o que está acontecendo no Brasil sem colocar no tabuleiro este fenômeno que tem sido a judicialização da vida de uma maneira geral. A maior parte das cortes constitucionais do mundo, das Supremas Cortes, desempenha dois papéis. O primeiro é o de proteger os direitos fundamentais e o segundo é o de proteger as regras do jogo democrático. Esses papéis, a Suprema Corte Brasileira desempenha relativamente bem, tão bem quanto qualquer outra corte do mundo e talvez até melhor em muitas situações. E, como disse anteriormente, direitos fundamentais de mulheres, de gays, de índios, discussões importantes como aborto, casamento de pessoas do mesmo sexo, pesquisas com células-tronco embrionárias, ações afirmativas, todas elas foram decididas e, a meu ver, bem decididas perante o Supremo Tribunal Federal. Portanto, esta judicialização e esta queixa que, às vezes, as pessoas que perdem têm em relação ao Supremo, acontece em toda parte do mundo. O problema, Steve, é que nós, a Suprema Corte Brasileira, tem uma competência que nenhuma outra corte tem no mundo, que é a de funcionar como tribunal criminal de primeiro grau para todas as autoridades de primeiro escalão inclusive todos os membros do Congresso Nacional. E existem no Supremo, hoje, cerca de 500 processos envolvendo parlamentares. Não há como isto não ser um fator problemático. Não há como isso não ser um fator de desestabilização. E, portanto, esta competência criminal do Supremo, seja a originária, no foro privilegiado que nós conseguimos reduzir, seja a recursal, que faz tudo chegar no Supremo, traz para o primeiro escalão do judiciário problemas que deviam ter morrido lá embaixo. Nos Estados Unidos, a discussão sobre o ex-presidente Lula, cujo mérito eu não darei uma palavra, mas em qualquer outro lugar do mundo, isso teria morrido em segundo grau de jurisdição, in the appellate level, pois o sistema brasileiro traz isso para o colo do Supremo. Portanto, parte das dificuldades que nós temos hoje no Brasil, que as pessoas associam à judicialização, não é uma associação correta. Judicialização é a definição de espaços entre interpretar a Constituição e legislar. E em todo o mundo existe este debate e dificuldade em se traçar esta fronteira. O que acontece no Brasil é mau desenho institucional, que faz o Supremo ser juiz criminal de primeiro grau. E, portanto, você traz para a cúpula do judiciário um embate ou com a classe política ou com a sociedade, porque, nesses casos de corrupção, quando eles são apreciados no Supremo, ou o Supremo funciona mal, e frequentemente funciona, e você se desgasta com a sociedade, ou ele funciona bem, você pune e cria um atrito com a classe política. Portanto, nós temos, no Brasil, um problema de desenho institucional, que eu e o Supremo, mas procurei atenuar da melhor forma possível, que era reduzindo drasticamente esta competência criminal do Supremo. Mas, diferentemente, Steve, de outras partes do mundo, o judiciário no Brasil é um ator que se tornou politicamente relevante, mais do que em outras partes. Uma razão é essa que eu acabo de descrever, mas há uma segunda razão. É que a política no Brasil, pelo custo e pelo contágio, ela deixou de atrair as novas vocações, deixou de atrair os jovens idealistas. Onde é que essa gente foi parar? No Judiciário ou no Ministério Público. E aí tentam mudar o mundo através da judicialização. O que não é ruim, mas tem um teto baixo, porque a partir de um certo ponto você precisa de política para tomar decisões políticas e você precisa de política de qualidade. Portanto, o que nós precisamos fazer no Brasil para diminuir a judicialização é requalificar a política e devolver a política ao centro do palco. Hoje em dia, uma discussão no Supremo atrai mais debate público do que uma discussão no Parlamento. É uma distorção completa, mas é o que acontece. Para dar um exemplo de pesquisas com células-tronco embrionárias, quando o debate foi no Congresso e eles aprovaram uma lei, passou em branco. Quando foi questionado no Supremo a possibilidade de pesquisa com células-tronco embrionárias, aí você teve um debate nacional. Portanto, há uma peça no tabuleiro institucional brasileiro que é um pouco diferente das democracias do resto do mundo. E esta judicialização avançou muito, acho que ela precisa recuar, mas ela precisa recuar com a ascensão da política, porque a judicialização, muitas vezes, ela é provocada pela própria classe política que vai ao Supremo e apresenta as suas demandas. A grande questão controvertida da hora, que é a descriminalização do aborto, está no Supremo, porque um partido político foi ao Supremo e pediu um pronunciamento. De modo que eu, nas suas pesquisas e nos seus interesses sempre tão ricos, no caso brasileiro, há uma peça diferente do tabuleiro, um pouco diferente de como esta peça é utilizada no tabuleiro mundial, que é um certo protagonismo do poder judiciário, que eu acho que é um dado que merece ser levado em conta. Eu vou ter que pedir 1 milhão de desculpas.
Mas posso só fazer mais uma pergunta? Tenho 5 minutos? Porque eu não consigo resistir à
eu tenho
tentação.
sessão, mas claro.
Que é justamente sobre, digamos, autocontenção e protagonismo do judiciário, particularmente da nossa Suprema Corte. Nós tivemos 2 oportunidades em que o STF criou uma nova norma política, com grandes consequências para o sistema. Um foi quando derrubou a cláusula de barreiras, que é o que produziu os 30 e poucos partidos que o professor Stephen mencionou no começo. Nem a gente consegue compreender a legenda, não esperamos que o senhor possa fazer. E a outra foi no fim do financiamento privado de campanha, o senhor foi o relator, e que agora vemos que a criação de um fundo público de campanha acaba produzindo, digamos, mais conservadorismo partidário, na medida em que pouquíssimos gerem um recurso bilionário em favor dos seus protegidos nos partidos. Portanto, o objetivo de renovação a gente não obteve. Não faltou autocontenção democrática do Supremo nesses 2 casos, pelo menos?
Não, acho que não. Mas acho que no primeiro ele errou e no segundo acertou.
No segundo, em que o senhor foi o relator.
Eu nem fui o relator, não. Embora meu voto tenha tido mais visibilidade. Deixa eu dizer, no caso da cláusula de barreira, eu me absolvo completamente, eu não estava no Supremo, eu escrevi defendendo as cláusulas de barreira e acho que qualquer futura antologia dos grandes equívocos do Supremo, esta decisão deve estar no topo. Foi um equívoco. Um equívoco um pouco motivado pelo espírito da época, que era proteger as legendas tradicionais de esquerda que acabariam com a aprovação da cláusula de barreira. Portanto, não foi um equívoco mal intencionado, foi um equívoco bem intencionado de proteger legendas legítimas, mas produziu um resultado desastroso. E eu não posso deixar de concordar com você, foi um erro. Agora, não foi propriamente ativismo, porque quando você provoca o Supremo e tem uma tese constitucional dizendo isto viola o direito das minorias, eu acho que o Supremo pode, mas se manifestar. Só que eu acho que se manifestou erradamente. No caso do financiamento eleitoral por campanha, aí você vai me desculpar, era preciso derrubar o modelo mafioso de financiamento eleitoral que havia no Brasil. Se é possível empresa participar ou não do financiamento eleitoral, é uma decisão para o Congresso, é uma decisão política. Nos Estados Unidos, houve a decisão política e a Suprema Corte, possivelmente da pior decisão dos últimos tempos, derrubou a limitação ao dinheiro nas eleições. Foi uma pena. Mas aqui, portanto, se empresa pode ou não, o Congresso é que tem que decidir. Mas naquele modelo, a imoralidade, o não republicanismo e a violação da Constituição era tão flagrante porque uma empresa podia tomar dinheiro emprestado no BNDES e utilizar o dinheiro público, o dinheiro do povo brasileiro, para financiar o candidato que ia defender os seus interesses. Isso é de uma imoralidade penosa. A empresa podia, como aconteceu, apoiar os 3 candidatos. E, portanto, apoiava a candidata Dilma, o candidato Aécio e a candidata Marina. Se uma mesma empresa está apoiando 3 candidatos, ela não está exercendo direito político. Ela está sendo achacada ou ela está comprando favores futuros. Em qualquer uma das hipóteses, é muito ruim. Em terceiro lugar, a lei não impedia que a empresa que financia a campanha do governador ou do prefeito seja, depois da eleição, contratada diretamente pelo eleito, de modo que o favor privado, que foi a doação, é pago com o dinheiro público do contrato administrativo. Portanto, Mônica, o sistema era completamente imoral. Quando o Supremo derrubou, a expectativa era que passasse o voto distrital misto, que baratearia as campanhas. Não passou E aí criou-se um problema. As campanhas continuam caras e não tem quem financie. Por isso que eu acho que a gente precisa mudar o modelo político. As pessoas temem agora que tenha dinheiro do crime organizado nas eleições. Mas eu não sei que nome eu daria exatamente para o modelo anterior de financiamento eleitoral. Portanto, não há alternativa que não seja, eu penso, baratear as eleições. De modo que eu acho que, no primeiro caso, eu concordo plenamente com você, foi uma decisão ruim, mas é preciso, no julgamento, situar historicamente as circunstâncias dos ministros, mas devo dizer que, desde aquela época, eu defendi a cláusula de barreira, mas a do financiamento eleitoral por empresa, eu acho que há esses problemas que eu acabo de revelar. Porém, para remediar isso, criou-se um fundo. O meu problema com esse fundo é menos o dinheiro que ele custa, porque, para ter uma política mais íntegra, eu toparia pagar o custo. O problema é que eles montaram um sistema de distribuição desses recursos que vai tornar mínima a renovação do Congresso.
Eles são danados, ministro.
E, portanto, não deu uma chance de errarem porque erram.
Não dê?
Eu vou pedir licença e desculpas, eu preciso pegar um voo para a sessão que começa às 2h. Eu tive muito prazer e muita honra de estar aqui, de conhecê-lo pessoalmente. Eu sou Senior Fellow na Kennedy School, então, de vez em quando, eu estou lá em Cambridge. I'm a Senior Fellow at the Kennedy School, so once in a while I'm there, and I'll be happy to have a cup of coffee with you when I'm there. Okay, probably in January I'll be there. Okay, good to meet you, congratulations. It's a great pleasure. Okay, Marcos.
Muito obrigada, ministro Barroso. O livro autografado